making great music is extremely important, but when you're running a business, you also have to consider like how can we get this out there? How can we introduce this to people? How can we? Because you make great music, and the goal of the label should be to find the audiences that can appreciate it. My name is Tom Moore, and I started Dots Per Inch Music. Like a lot of people, I didn't know what a record label was. You know, I knew that there were brands and there were insignias on all the packaging I'd get as a kid listening to music for the first time. And I think one of the first projects I became aware of it with was probably the artist Chad Van Galen or maybe Radiohead when I was 13 or 14, and just kind of exploring album credits, because these were the first records that I would buy with my own money, and then seeing all the text and seeing all the like context that went into making these projects became interesting to me. And then finding out that these companies could have other acts that they've worked with that I would then discover and realize that I liked, and finding the kind of curatorial element to be very interesting. The interest was in the process and the mediation of music, how it's captured, how it's displayed, and that that interest in packaging and delivery kind of led me to study what I studied in college, which was anthropology and music with experimental humanities, which sounds very pretentious, but experimental humanities was kind of like media studies, really. And so I did a experimental ethnography of album packaging and how different music media create social settings. And something like the one that was most interesting that kept popping up was when I asked people about how they listened to vinyl, describe the room, whatever. People would frequently describe sitting around in a circle as if the turntable was a fireplace or something, which to me was funny because turntables and stereophonic audio are directional. There's never been a world in which you sit around a record player. You might sit and face the record player, you might ignore the direction of it, but it was basically this made-up memory that everyone seemed to have around this bonfire, like kumbaya thing, which was just very funny to me. And so exploring media, and and there are other things that I wrote about, but that was always that was kind of how the label started, was thinking about packaging, thinking about delivery. And by this point, I was doing a lot of DIY programming at my college, booking, punk shows in a garage in the forest, and having seen so much more live music, kind of understanding that, when I was a kid and I couldn't see concerts very much, live music was rare, and so the records were music. And by the time that when I was getting older, I was seeing so many more shows, and that was really the music, and the album was the particular instance of that music. And that split really was kind of how, it was when I was figuring that out that the label started. I did a couple of things. I was trying to get a job in recorded music and couldn't. I remember walking into the beggar's office with a resume, and they were kind of shocked that their doors weren't locked, and it was very awkward. I remember definitely emailing countless companies that I didn't understand what they did or who they were, what their brands were, just thinking that I could just get in the door somehow, and also refusing to take internships for the most part because I don't believe in not being paid for work ever. I capitulated. I ended up taking a internship that paid for my lunch, which was kind of, the compromise, I guess. And that was at a label called Cantaloupe Music, which is a classical and experimental, new classical music. New music is kind of how they oriented themselves. And they were an artist-run label that started by doing events. And so that was very similar to kind of my experience at the time, where I had all this experience in live music, but I was trying to work with records and not figuring that out. And so when I had this internship with Cantaloupe, and this was summer of 2016, I was living in a rent-controlled apartment illegally in the East Village that I couldn't enter or exit between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., and I had this very weird life for a few months, and and yeah, just working on really interesting music and learning about publishing and all that. But ultimately, this was not a normal record label because, like I said, they were started in live music, and they would do these marathon concerts in art galleries. That's in the 1980s. That's how they started. And these marathon concerts were interesting musically because with classical music, there is this feeling that you go in, you sit, you watch, you leave, but you see the whole piece of music. And they didn't like that. They wanted a bit more of like a punk atmosphere or a gallery atmosphere. And so they started doing these marathons where they programmed so much music without intermission that you would have to leave at some point. So that they tried to normalize it by changing the infrastructure of what a live classical music or experimental music concert feels like. And so these concerts would be 24 hours long of just back to back to back to back new pieces of music by local composers and chamber groups and things like that. Which this has now kind of evolved into the Bang in a Can Fest. It's at Mass MoCA in Massachusetts, which is an amazing music festival of classical music. Yeah, but that is they kind of took that praxis, and that was the seed that started the record label. And that ultimately it was that summer that I started Dots Per Inch, and it was kind of the same thing. I had never really worked at a label that was a normal kind of, we do records, we do marketing campaigns, we have a relationship with mastering engineers and DSPs and everything. I had never been in that world, and so I started a label and was, basically spent the first year insisting it wasn't a tape label, which was kind of, that was the beginning of it. So, and I've still never worked at a record label except Dots Per Inch. So it's going to things like these trade conferences like I was at this week. It's kind of funny sometimes, like hearing the way people talk about things. They still seem completely alien, even though I've been doing this for almost a decade now. I ran a venue in college. That's kind of how it started. I booked a lot of, some really weird thing. Being in the Hudson Valley, you're 100 miles away from New York City, which is far enough to not be part of the system here, but close enough to have a lot of these really amazing things kind of pass through. We would do, 3 shows a week, so it wasn't that much, and it was free for college students, so it wasn't based on ticket sales. It was based on, more than anything, like my taste and the taste of the people I worked with, and I worked with some really incredible people there just by chance. But these shows were amazing because we would have a band like Horse Lords come, like this experimental group from Baltimore, and then we'd have this artist Partisan Fontaine from Newburgh, New York, who we thought he was massively famous, and then we found out when we booked him that it was his first show, that his manager didn't know how to fill out a W-9, and it was a really like, wow, what's going on? And 3 months after we were working with him, he was with DJ Khaled in Los Angeles and ended up writing a lot of Cardi B's like second record, I think, or something like that. And so there were so many things like that where it wasn't because we were smarter or more hip to anything, but we were just in this place and like trying to get things that our friends would want to go to. And then it happened enough, really by luck, that when I moved to the city, people thought that I knew things that I didn't know in the live music world. And I was trying to get jobs at record labels, but kept getting job offers at venues, and eventually ran out of money. I bought a Marxist book on the problems with money and capitalism, and found out that I had overdrafted my account with that purchase, which is ironic, I think. But yeah, so basically started working door, started managing the floor of a venue. A couple years later, the DIY part had never left, even though I was working in these more commercial venues in New York, and that creativity to event production was definitely part of the edge that the venue I worked at for a long time, Baby's All Right, has had. But yeah, at this point I've directly produced more than 3,000 performances and probably been involved in close to 10,000. So it's just second nature at this point.
You just keep dropping the ball. You're starting to think, was it worth it at all?
So many people move to New York because they grow up thinking it's the best place on earth. And coming from the suburbs of Chicago, I did not have that feeling. I went to school upstate New York, followed all my friends down here, did not think that this was going to be any different of a place than any other place I'd ever been. And found found myself falling in love with it more than anyone I know. So it did absolutely influence the beginning of Dots Per Inch music because it was exciting to kind of discover the city while I was discovering really what I was doing with the label. So they kind of grew up in tandem together. And a city that has so much going on like New York is constantly educating and constantly informing how I see and understand music. And I've had because I'm in New York. Dots Per Inch is not a provincial record label, and that's I think one of its great advantages. Way too many people think of punk as a sound, as like a texture, as a aesthetic category, and punk is, if you go back and like look at the bills at CBGB's or Max's Kansas City or all these venues that had punk. I mean, Beastie Boys, Madonna, the Lounge Lizards, and the Ramones were all playing the same clubs, and they were all kind of part of this punk community, but they weren't a sound. And I think that in hindsight, punk is the Ramones or whatever. It's like that. It is that like post-modern lovers kind of like simple pared back thing. But I saw this interview with the Beastie Boys that was really interesting, and they were kind of being questioned on like, you know, are they punk or are they hip hop? And they're like, we never thought about it. We were just making music in our community, and really it was like years into our career that we were like a hip hop group. And to them, when they started making guitar music in the late '90s, it wasn't weird. They didn't think of it as a real transition. They were, and like seeing them talk about it in these interviews was super interesting because, yeah, I mean, people think of hip hop as this sound, and you know, yeah, like punk as this sound, but really like New York just has these like contradictory and eclectic communities, and that in that sense, Dots Per Inch is a very New York record label because everyone says that the artists that I work with are kind of similar, but if you were to compare them on an aesthetic ground, they don't sound remotely the same. When I sign an act, there is a tone. I mean, the first thing I'll do is set up a group chat with the people involved in the band. So if it's a solo artist and their manager, we just kind of have like a group chat where we just rap, and nothing is really decided. Nothing is ever, assigned in that setting, but it's kind of, we can check in, be like, oh, is this art coming or whatever. But beyond that, it's completely different for everything. So if some bands I'm facilitating the recording of a project from start to finish, and is it, I mean, for example, working with this artist Lucy Cooper B. Handy, he is a underground legend, like someone who completely changed the way I thought. How I didn't know music could sound the way it sounded when he performed, and he's one of the reasons I started the label. I was trying to sign him for probably, I mean, before the label even existed, basically. So for years, and a fiercely independent artist, an incredibly talented artist whose name is Lucy, Lucy, had terrible SEO, a catalog that was split between YouTube channels that had been taken down for copyright issues that he couldn't resolve because he didn't have, a label or a manager to kind of support with these issues, and, videos that existed on other account pages, and just, it was everywhere, and it was very hard to be a fan of his. And so with him, my workflow is basically like saying, hey, let me take your back catalog, organize it, clean up the SEO, redistribute it so it's all under one page, and just see how your audience can just grow just because it becomes a little bit easier. And that was kind of how we started working together. So I was not creatively involved whatsoever. I was only finding the highest res versions of the album artwork that had not existed in 6 years or something, and working with graphic designers to kind of recreate certain textures, and basically doing archival work. And that relationship established enough trust with him where he was willing to do a debut studio record with Dots Per Inch, and that was, he had gone from producing everything on GarageBand in a laptop in Hadley, Massachusetts, to he and I were at my friend's studio in Los Angeles mixing using $100 audio plugins and really trying to make it sound like the hip hop records that he loves. And so that was just one artist and two very different practices. And and then another example that's completely different is the artist May Rio basically will send me an album that's done, and then I'm just going to help her find the mixing engineer, and I'll sit in the mixing room and make some suggestions, and that's completely different. Grace Ives had an amazing album that was just mixed terribly, and she had released it. That's how I found it. I reached out to her and asked that she take it down and that we remake the whole thing together, and that's how that album came to be. And working on textures, and I mean, I mixed that record myself, so that was also completely different than the others. So it really changes based on what the act needs or wants. I think that the older the label grows, I've actually been kind of less involved in the studio, which I don't know if that's a trend or just it's happened 3 times in a row, and the next artist I sign, I will be mixing again. But some artists are like, who can I pay to make my art? Because they don't want to do it, they're not interested in it. And others have simply provided amazing assets without ever thinking that they would hire anyone for it. So I'm here to if you assume that every artist needs a creative director, you're assuming that you need a $10,000 expense that every artist needs to recoup that not every artist really needs. And so the approach is catered because it saves money, and doing profit share deals with artists means that saving budget on the project means being that much closer to recoupment soon, which is very important. Making great music is extremely important, but when you're running a business, you also have to consider how can we get this out there? How can we introduce this to people? How can we, because you make great music, and the goal of the label should be to find the audiences that can appreciate it. And so the label's focus has to be a little bit more commercial than the artists, and that is something that is obvious, but in praxis can be very awkward at times. So telling an artist that they have to be engaged in social media or things like that. So when I'm signing an artist now, I'm trying to fish that out a little bit more than I used to. I would never consider an act that I didn't enjoy their music first. But after that point, I want to make sure that I can actually help advance their career. Otherwise, I support them remaining independent, is kind of how that works. So the selection process is kind of 2 very different considerations happening one after the other. First, it's creative, vibe, do we get along? Do you want to go to the shows that are in the community? Do you want to play 20 shows this year and, exhaust yourself but get your music out there? That's part 1. Part 2 is, does this artist need to label at all? Because I think a lot of artists don't, especially now. And if they don't, what am I doing trying to sign them? For me, it's not going to be getting everything I think is cool. There have been amazing acts that I've passed on because I don't think that I can help them out. There are a couple of things. When I was starting a record label, you're telling artists that, hey, I've got a record label. And in the very beginning, it's just your confidence versus the world. Because like I mentioned earlier, couldn't get a job at a record label, so I literally didn't know what I was doing. The first artist I signed was this artist, Jack Whitescarver, who now performs under the name Amateur. He and I basically had an agreement where it was I'm going to kind of mess around and experiment, and you're going to get a record deal, but you're not really ready for a record deal, and I'm not really ready to sign an artist. So we're going to just kind of do this together and figure it out. And, that process, that trust is huge. And it's from that I learned that, okay, if I'm going to sign an artist, I need to make sure that I have that. First of all, if I don't know what I'm doing with something, if they need something that I've not experienced in, at this point, I'm really good at figuring things out, and I think that that's often better than someone who says, I know exactly what to do. That's an advantage. But what kind of started happening early on is like, okay, I'm distributing through CD Baby, and I'm realizing that really, what is the value of what I'm offering the artist, and are they getting the best thing possible? In terms of project management, pretty much from the beginning, I think that Dots Per Inch has been really, really good. Like, very good at helping artists get organized, getting their image and their representation together, helping artists remember that, well, music is powerful and sincere and full of emotion. It's also show business, and it's about presentation, and it's about, kind of standing up there and saying, look at me. That's always been great, but I've always needed, to know that I'm offering, is our sync team like really repping this stuff? I then worked with a distributor, this invite-only distributor, and while I was with them, started to make money for the first time. It was when I was putting out Grace Ives' first record, and was completely caught off guard when they decided they were going to reorganize their company and kick everyone off. They're going to just start over. And so I was in the middle of an album campaign, or maybe the album had just come out, and I was losing distribution. And so simultaneously, I found this company. It's called Consolidated Independent as my backup, and that's my insurance policy. And I moved the catalog over there to make sure the metadata was all good. And then started working with a different distributor, which went to a different distributor, which now I'm with Fuga. And what's happened with each of these is, you meet with distributors and they say, we have marketing. We're going to pitch you to playlists and all this. And, anything that is not concrete, like we have good deals, we offer good terms, our tech is good, I've learned really doesn't matter in the distribution sphere. What matters is competence with tech and artist support and, replying to emails quickly, because when I work with an artist and they see that their track name is misspelled on Apple Music because they don't like capital letters very much, it's nice to know that I can reach out to someone and get that corrected, and that the company will prioritize it and understand it, which is not common, actually. And so working with Fuga has been very positive because, all these things can feel kind of silly when you zoom in on them. Like, does this track name need to be capitalized this way? Like, technically, no. Like, how many people are going to notice it? Maybe no one. But the artist cares, and having a distributor that can, leverage their heft and their tech to get the artist represented properly is extremely important, and has been a huge plus of working with Fuga. So positive moments in like the business growth of the label are they're not specific. There are abstract moments of recognition, and there are, subtle acknowledgments by people in the business. But the best feeling is when an artist kind of finishes album cycle and is saying that they feel really good about how things have gone. And I'm very lucky to have had that conversation with every artist I've worked with. Even when a project is, not necessarily a commercial project, more of like an art-focused project, or more of a logistics project, or something that is not necessarily bringing money in for the artist right away. It's very good to know that, like, in some way at least, the project has helped, and that the label has helped, and those are the moments where, particularly when an artist is out of contract and they make the effort to reach out and say that this was a positive experience, that's what keeps things going, and that feels really good.
Stone was to say